Okay. So here we are back all in the same room, and let me now pass over to Klaus Fruschnis from the Fundación Daniel and Nina Carasso. He is also the vice chair of the Arts and Culture Funders Forum. So Klaus, over to you.
Thank you, Maria. I hope that you hear me well. So I hope that this the previous panel actually was interesting. There's so many things that were said that it was really interesting. Actually, I wanted to spend more time with my colleagues actually from room number 2. So good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure, of course, to open this peer learning webinar series that we called Cultural Philanthropy in Action. And our gathering reflects the shared commitment of philanthropic organizations across Europe to strengthening the arts and cultural sector, and of course, ensuring its resilience in times of profound transformation. That's what we just talked 1 minute before in the group. And as you all know, we're navigating unprecedented global challenges, shaped by social, digital, and ecological transitions. And in this shift in philanthropy, to me, actually, the role of philanthropy in supporting arts and culture has never been more critical than today. And art is not merely a tool, it is a force for change. And I see it as something that questions actually conventions, amplifies underrepresented voices, and inspires new ways of imagining the future. And the cultural sector is still remain very vulnerable today, facing financial and structural insecurities. And I guess that the philanthropy sector has remained a steadfast ally. And arts and culture are among the top fields of investment by philanthropy, both globally and in Europe. And every 5 years, the Arts and Culture Funders Forum delivers a unique piece of work. So it is a mapping on the state of philanthropy funding the arts, for the arts and culture. And the first edition that was published before the pandemic presented a landscape that differed significantly from the second edition that was published in 2023. And if you have questions, I saw Lucia is somewhere here among the different faces. So she's the author of that mapping, and I think it's quite interesting. And I hope that we're going to share it on the chat. So the latest mapping actually revealed key trends. So that I wanted to share with you some of those. Actually, 90% of the founders maintain continuity in their support for the arts, which is really good. 20% launch new strategies embedding innovative funding models, increased flexibility, or expanded priority areas. 50% introduce internal changes or new programs addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion, a topic that is really important today. And I'm not going into politics right now, but you see that 50% is a quite important number. 57% increase engagement with their beneficiaries and partners. And as we look ahead, of course, the next edition of this mapping will begin next year, if I'm correct. Let maybe Larry or Lucia confirm. But I mean, capturing the idea is to capture how these current challenges are shaping the realities of both artists, but also the cultural practitioners. As we, philanthropic organizations dedicate our support, our finances to support them. So it is crucial, actually. Today is an important moment for reflection that we are starting to get today together. And just to give you some frame actually for this talk is that today's discussion and those that follow build on the insights gained during our gathering last year in Zagreb at the European Philanthropy for Just Triple Transition. That was an event organized by Cultura Nova and Philea. And there we were a couple of foundations, and then we identified critical changes in the arts and cultural sector and the need for philanthropy to adopt a more strategic and transformative approach. The Arts and Culture Funders Forum, as Ilaria just mentioned before, does not merely observe these trends, but it acts upon them. And every 2 years, we focus on a new thematic priority to ensure that those sectors remain responsive and emerging challenges. And for instance, in 2023, 2024, the focus was on culture, arts, and the environment. And it was a quite interesting topic because it led us to the creation of the Eco Arts Nexus repository, an initiative that fostered a strong connection between culture and the ecological transition. And I think we're going to share the document, the repository. There is a link actually, there is a website actually, that you all can contribute if you want. So this is why these sessions actually have been carefully structured to translate insights into concrete action. So we're here not only today, but through the series to explore philanthropy and how philanthropy can better align the efforts, not just as a response to immediate needs, but also as a driver of long-term structural change. Some of the questions I want to share with you, 4 questions that we asked ourselves last year that are quite important and help us to really understand how we thought, actually, how we designed these webinars. So how do we ensure sustainable support for artists and cultural workers beyond short-term project cycles? How can international collaboration among founders foster stronger cross-border artistic ecosystems? What alternative funding models, such as social investment and microgrants, can expand opportunities for social practitioners? How do we shift from the power dynamics to ensure that artists and cultural workers play a central role in shaping their own future? I agree that these are not simple questions, but the essential is that if we want to move forward fragmented support towards a more impactful cultural sector, then we have to ask these questions. And I guess this is a safe place to do so. In additional, of course, to these conversations, we hold one today. There is one in April and one in May. These discussions will not be isolated because they will feed into the Philea Forum in Lisbon this June, where we will further explore these themes in a session entitled Arts Without an Agenda. And this, of course, will be an opportunity to bring this reflection into a broader European philanthropic context, engaging with a wider network of funders, but also a collective dialogue for the future of cultural philanthropy. And just to conclude, I just want to say that the Arts and Culture Founders Forum is a space for action. And over the years, it has evolved. I mean, it has evolved from an information sharing platform to a collaborative force that we are now opening to all partners. And so we foster partnerships, knowledge exchange, and a stronger advocacy for the arts and culture sectors across Europe. But of course, I mean, there's so much to do still. So, and my hope is that, I mean, I encourage you, all of us today, to think boldly, to challenge conventional approaches, explore new ways philanthropy can act, not just as a funder, but also as a catalyst for meaningful change. And I see that some of you, I mean, you're for foundations, but also I see some partners as well. And I think that together we can really ensure that the arts remain at the heart of a just and sustainable future. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussions, not only today, but also in the upcoming months.
Thank you, Klaus, and we really celebrate how much the Arts and Culture Funders Forum has done this opening also to other voices, because it's really critical to also kind of open philanthropy to other sectors. And so now let me hand over to Tsveta Andreeva from the European Cultural Foundation. The European Cultural Foundation is chairing the Arts and Culture Funders Forum, and Tsveta will lead us from now until the very end of this webinar. So Tsveta, over to you.
Hello, I'm Tsveta Andreeva from the European Culture Foundation, based in Amsterdam. I'm not going to continue on the introductions, but only would like to thank everyone for joining this, the first of this seminar series that we have initiated this year as Arts and Culture Funders Forum. Because our time is really limited, I'll go straight to introducing the speakers, but I want to thank very much Klaus too, who introduced in a very beautiful way the way we work together as foundations, and we really hope that these exchanges, although online, could contribute to us better aligning our work in the future and connecting better also to the community of stakeholders, partners that is out there, that is not necessarily part of our smaller group of foundations. I would like to, without further ado, introduce the first speaker. We have actually today 4 speakers in our webinar. The first one is Elena Polivtseva, a culture policy expert at European level, who has actually founded her own think tank last year. She has worked in the European networks for many years, and she's going to talk about the recent study that she has done for Culture Action Europe, the State of Culture report. And I'm going just to go make a quick round of the speakers first. Then we have 2 more like foundations that are going to speak. 2 representatives of Paul Hamlin Foundation, Ms. Holly Donald, Director of Strategic Learning, Insight and Influence, and Shubhik Bandopayai, Head of Arts Program. Sorry if I mispronounced it, but you can introduce yourself better later. And Herr Oksam from Head of Grant Making and Impact of the Cultuurfonds, Netherlands. So these will be the speakers for this first round. I'm going to start immediately with Elena because she has to leave at 3 o'clock sharp. And I will give you, after her short presentation on the insights of the State of Culture report, she can get a few questions and answers from you. I think it will be really important that you can also discuss some of the things she's going to introduce. Just to give you just a little bit of background, the State of Culture report has been published by Culture Action Europe last year and presented widely at European level and across Europe on different occasions. So it's already a very popular read in the culture and arts field. We would like to really address the biggest issues of the democratic backsliding, shrinking civic spaces. Why is culture funding across Europe shrinking too, for various reasons, non-related this time to any dramatic economic trouble? And to emphasize, of course, why culture is important to amplify the voices, to foster civic engagement, and of course, what can we do together? So I'm giving the floor to Elena to start with her presentation.
Thank you very much, Sveta, and I will try to share my screen. Just a second. So hello, everyone, again. So I'm Elena. I am an independent researcher based in Brussels, and I will get straight to the presentation of the State of Culture report, as Sveta said, was commissioned by Culture Action Europe. So basically, the name of this report sounds quite ambitious, of course. So the goal was, broadly speaking, to highlight the key issues, challenges, and let's say topics what are important for the cultural sector in broad sense today in Europe. And especially we focused also on how can we match, on one hand, the needs and self-perception of the cultural sector, and on the other hand, the change in the world of politics and policies. So in order to write this report, so there were a few steps in this project. So there was actually quite a comprehensive review of key documents presenting national cultural policies of all 27 member states. Not every member state has a specific document, but all the relevant resources in this field. There was a big survey which collected around 700 responses. There were expert interviews, review of key papers of the members of the Culture Action Europe network. And we also undertook desk research specifically to pull together some key data to depict, to understand basically the bigger picture, the context in which we are trying to depict the state of culture. And let us go straight to that bigger picture, so which is not so newsy for none of you, I guess. So there are too many crises, and this was still 2024. There are some hard data suggesting us that indeed we're living in challenging times, maybe more challenging than 10, 15 years ago, in terms of the climate crisis kind of enhancing. There are more and more conflicts going on in the world, and there are wars at the borders of Europe, of course. There are also economic slowdown, which was highlighted recently in the competitiveness report, also at the EU level. And this kind of catchy words like social polarization, decay of democracy, and freedom of expression. These are not just catchy titles from the media, but indeed there is data which is being collected by NGOs, which suggested that we are facing those issues. And AI, together with other digital technologies, becoming more and more seen as a challenge rather than just an opportunity or innovation, let's say, pathway. So this kind of multi-crisis environment, as they like to call it, calls for responsive, like crisis-driven policy making. So if we listen to key speeches being thrown at the political level, if we look at the papers such as United Nations Pact of the Future or political guidelines of the European Commission, I'm talking now about big documents kind of defining the political landscape. we see that it's always, the crisis is always at the heart. It's in the middle, and everything else which is happening is kind of trying to respond to that crisis, to adapt to it, and to counter it. So there is, in general, a lot of responsiveness, which also makes it a bit more short-term. There's also this kind of obsession with calculating what is going to happen. So there's less and less imagination or long-term forecasting. Instead of what we're having instead is rather like different techniques to predict what is happening next. And basically, all in all, to speak in very general terms, everything which is like less predictable is losing its trust. And there are also a lot of studies recently came up, which also feature the fading trust in general in societies, and also between citizens and governments, and between governments themselves. So what place or what role for culture in this kind of context? Is culture being treated indeed as a partner to solve all those problems? Is it being more treated as an instrument, or maybe neither of both of these? So there are a lot of, in fact, takeaways in the State of Culture report. This document is 160 pages, and I really invite you to read it. Today, I'm going to focus on this instrumentalization piece and on the political kind of attacks on culture. So just to say, we are focusing here on cultural policies. So it's basically everything which comes from governments and not other funders. And one of the key takeaways is not so new, in fact, for the cultural sector, neither, I guess, for the public today. And it is about the growing trend of hyper-instrumentalization and cultural policy. And by hyper-instrumentalization, we understand the enhancing, increasing trend of articulating and justifying the value of culture, or even existence of culture portfolio, of cultural funding at the national level, in the terms of other areas which are not necessarily even linked to culture, such as international relations, rural development, well-being and health, economics, education, and many other fields. While the concept of intrinsic value of culture, or the so-called art for art's sake, becoming actually quite shameful terms, they are not being defined, neither respected anywhere in the policy discourse. And so reviewing the national policies, like they really to trying to analyze the discourse of those documents, we have come up with a snapshot which presents different areas through which cultural value is being today talked about, and through which cultural value is being justified. So national governments see culture primarily as a social sector. So you see that actually quite big focus is on cohesion, inclusion, and equality. And also, while these words can sound nice, but there's also big focus on using culture for making homogeneous society. So that's quite dominant in some of the cultural policy documents at the national level. Other pieces which are quite important, equally important, we can say international relations, economics, identity, and well-being. And I also put here this indispensable value, or we can call it intrinsic value, because these terms, even if not being defined, appeared quite vaguely in some of the national cultural policy documents. So we also looked at the EU EU discourse on culture. And there it's interesting, we looked really at 15 years how these key documents like World Plan for Culture or Legal Basis of Creative Europe has evolved. It's interesting, there are at least two things to say. On one hand, there was this intrinsic value reference used in the past, so it has completely disappeared in the past 15 years. And also, if we look at guiding principles of the World Work Plan for Culture of the EU, or the specific objectives of Creative Europe, we see that slowly but steadily, those specific objectives of cultural program basically are being about something else in culture. So if before the objectives were like boost mobility in the cultural sector, or skills, or networking, or cultural diversity, artistic development, etc., so slowly it's going towards some other dimensions like international relations, creative economy, etc., etc. So in a way, one might say that there is definitely, and I totally agree, definitely nothing wrong with recognizing the value of culture in many different other fields. And it's actually a positive trend that there are more and more of those debates which are not related directly to arts, in which culture is being featured. But there are a few problems let's say, which relate to this hyper-instrumentalization. And the first one is that there is still a huge gap between how policymakers value culture and how the cultural sector, sees its own role. There are at least two aspects here. One aspect is about modalities in which culture works. So, and this is not a new topic, and we have been talking about this measuring impact, understanding the value, quantitative, qualitative, etc. approaches. There is this kind of, through our research, what was evident is that artists or cultural organizations see their activities, be it initiatives or more structured activities, as one piece of the puzzle, which contributes to the bigger, let's say, public good, which is called culture, the ongoing, let's say, debate of who we are as a society, which is happening through centuries and through histories. So this is how artists see their own contribution to the world. How funders often see it, it's mostly, okay, you can still finish your project, you don't have to speak about its impact during your project, but be sure that within the next 3 months or a year, there is something at least to some extent concrete which comes out. It's not a problem because there are some concrete things which come out of every project being funded, but maybe the issue is that the actual value of culture is not being talked about, and we are instead talking about something quite else. So, and another problem here, or be it a problem or let's say gap, is that the cultural sector itself sees its own value like this, basically. Again, this was based on the survey, so of the state of culture research, so it might, of course, change, or maybe another time we would have a slightly different snapshot, but here we see that social value for cultural sector is more important than anything else. You see economics somewhere up there in blue. You see even environment not being such a big area here. And then if you remember, the national cultural policymakers also value cultural sector mostly for the social value. But here is a big difference. Cultural sector sees itself as a catalyst, you see, for dialogue, pluralism, critical thinking, imagining the future, debate, civic engagement, so everything which is to do with the difference, accommodating diversity of society. While when we go back to the society piece, which emerged through the national cultural policy making, it's actually more about homogenizing society, making it more cohesive, making it more, let's say, which is not necessarily negative as such. So, and then, as one of the academics put it, out of the politics of survival, the cultural sector still, of course, adopts this instrumentalizing view on culture, and even sometimes does it before it's been asked to do it. And there are also quite some studies which say that this instrumentalization of culture leads ultimately to homogenization of cultural offer, because in the cultural sector, there is already this expectation that there is a need to be socially engaged, to be environmentally aware, to produce something that is responding to very concrete questions. And in the end, in the last 10 years, there is kind of very clear trends which emerge if we analyze cultural offer. At the same time, there is also, of course, the digital tools impact, because everything these days needs to be taggable in a way, recognized, in order to be actually visible on digital platforms, which also leads to this interesting trend, which still needs to be researched further, this homogenization of the cultural and artistic offer. So another interesting question is, has instrumentalization of culture been useful for the cultural sector at all? So here you see some bullet points which are substantiated by data in the report itself. There is a study of UNESCO about the dynamics of the cultural investment, which has only dropped in the last 12 years globally. If you look at Europe, at the EU level, a cultural investment is 0.5% of GDP on the average, so which is really, really low. And in the last 12 years, in the last 10 years, in 22 countries, cultural investment has decreased or remained stable. Stable means not higher than the 0.5%. And basically in 6 or 7 countries, this has increased. But the study of Eurostat was done in 2023, so the last budget cuts are not there yet. So precarious working conditions, this is not something we have to talk about. This is quite clear. There were also a lot of studies, one of them done by Culture Action Europe, where above 90% of people say that their cultural work doesn't allow them to have a salary so they have to resort to other professions. So there is also lack of political recognition. Culture is obviously absent by the end of the day from Green Deal, from the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, from the Pact of the Future even. So there's a lot of important debates in which culture is not included. And finally, we often associate instrumentalization of culture with the potential to get money from other ministries. But another UNESCO study tells us that only 6% of all programs which support culture actually involve to some extent non-cultural ministries. So this is still also quite undeveloped. So
Elena, can you please wrap up with the presentation so that we get a bit of questions to you? Thanks.
I will try to wrap up.
Yeah.
So basically, this also makes culture quite fragile in the face of what is happening today. And what is happening today, and here we can basically come to the State of Culture 2025. This is my last slide, because this report was written before October 2024. So what happened today is that there are like budget cuts in many countries. There is no yet like a big picture, big understanding of that. But we know about Germany, France, Sweden, we know about Italy, Eastern Europe, etc. So there's also increasing attacks on artistic freedom, also in countries where it hasn't been happening before. There are also, at the EU level, interestingly, culture is of course absent from these renewed, very difficult conversations about the future of Europe, competitiveness, strategic autonomy, global tensions, etc. But if culture is appearing there in maybe 2 lines in some key documents, it's actually, again, about creative industry. Culture was called in the budget committee paper one of the most dynamic leading industries of Europe, which is quite surprising to see. So it looks like that we are back to some very, very scarce argumentation, and we're back to economic cards. And I invite you all to read that report. So I will stop sharing my screen. And I think the link to the report was already shared in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We thank you. Maybe we get a few questions if there are any of the participants, because there was quite a conversation going on in the chat, but not really questions to you. I hope to see some hands raised in among the audience. Of course, they will have the chance to read the report. It's quite a reading, but it's super insightful, and it's already shared in the chat. You can have it for yourself. Are there any questions immediately? I might not be able to see it. We still have a few more minutes for Elena before we continue with the other speakers. Then we will have a bit shorter time for the discussion after them, but still enough time. Luis Correa.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Thanks, Elena, for the presentation. I just had a clarification question, if you could say a bit more what you mean by intrinsic value of culture and what support for that might look like. Because when you shared that second graphic where you show the social well-being, etc., outcomes of the art sector and how it sees itself, that wasn't really what I was thinking when you talked about the intrinsic value of culture. So if you could clarify that. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. It's a very good question, because there are 2 things to say. On one hand, and I was maybe very briefly mentioning, it's not defined anywhere. So there's even a whole like festival of contradictory references in cultural policy making to intrinsic value. Something like culture is intrinsically important because it contributes to economics. So there's a lot of these phrases, and some of them are also featured in the State of Culture reports. So it's a very, very confusing concept when it comes to culture policy making discourse. When we surveyed our cultural sector respondents, stakeholders, we did not give them an option to tick intrinsic value. So they only had to choose between those fields we already identified through the analysis of national cultural policy documents, and we deliberately left out intrinsic value. And a lot of comments came there that I don't want to participate in your survey because it is instrumentalizing culture. So another thing to say, the fact that intrinsic value is not defined in cultural policymaking doesn't mean that it's not defined anywhere else. There are actually a lot of very important studies or let's say research more in academic field done, which talk about what this can mean. And it's very important, I think, to remember that when we say culture is important for or culture contributes to, it's not always mean that we are instrumentalizing culture. I think there are kind of, and I could share later this this material, but there is a framework which explains what intrinsic value is, and this is related to everything which is connected to intrinsic experience of culture. So this could be something relating to identity, like personal individual identity, reflexive value, aesthetic value, leisure, entertainment, even no matter how much we don't like these words. But there are this bunch of values, and then there are values which are integration of minorities or basically boosting economics. Those are external values. So there is a kind of several type of different values which can be assumed as intrinsic. How this can be supported? So this is another big question. I don't know if I have time to talk about it further, but I think it's a lot about modalities between relation between the funder and the beneficiary. And if it's more equal, and when it's like the priorities defined jointly and the whole modality of project, I think it's much closer to what we call intrinsic than the other way around. And I'm sorry, I took too.
There is another question exactly about that came from Niels Lauten from Philea. Well, and it's exactly about how on the instrumentalizing dimension, which we are also very busy with in our Arts and Culture Funders Forum. So how to fulfill how actually funder can support art without instrumentalizing, without guiding the content, and how do we select what we fund? You know, is there what role actually funders can play in like in balancing these issues? Because we saw like there is a huge gap between how artists and cultural professionals see themselves, their role, and how the policy makers are seeing it. But where is philanthropy in this? And how can we, where do we intervene, and how do we do it without instrumentalizing culture? Elena.
Like such difficult questions for someone who just looked at the problems and didn't really chase solutions. But of course, I will try to be super brief. I mean, there are plenty of ways how this can be done. And there are plenty of different frameworks which already been tested all over the place. You know, I don't know if you heard about this contract of resonance. And again, it goes a bit to what I just was talking about. It's like when a funder and the beneficiary come together and say, what is our joint goal? And this joint goal should be something, how can our initiative resonate with everything else which is around us, the society, the city, the village, whatever. And then they try to define it together. They don't define the topic necessarily. This needs to be about climate or about, although this is not wrong either. And then by doing this together, they're trying to create an initiative which is in resonance, which is not art for the art's sake, but it is kind of trying to really not to be a project, because project as such, it's always thinking what will happen in 3 years, but to think about what is happening today and to be more responsive to the emerging needs. And there are many other ways, and I will share with you here in the chat another publication we actually just launched with IETM, which actually talks about it, shifting focus from the imagined future, the end of the project, towards the foundations of the arts, the different ways in which art becoming actual resource or the infrastructure in a soft way, and not the constant jump from initiative to initiative. Yeah.
Are there any other questions on this topic? Or on the report in general, on Elena's intervention? I'll be curious to hear. How do you respond to the instrumentalization, to the also other issues she highlighted? The lack of funding, the reduction of funding for all various reasons, and what we can do as philanthropic organizations. Many of you work actually in local areas, in specific countries. How do you address those topics, and how does it? I don't see any hands raised, but I suppose there will be questions coming to Elena after you had read the report. And since she has to leave us in a few moments, please, if you have a question, write it in the chat or send it later. and we can tackle it at a different occasion, because this is not a topic we can exhaust in 10-15 minutes. So if there are no other immediate questions, I think we can continue with the 3 other speakers. And thank Elena, of course, for her intervention. We will see you soon, and we hope you get also more questions by some of the participants later. Don't hesitate to do that. Thank you very much, Elena. And I would like then to give the floor to the representatives of Paul Hamlin Foundation, Holy Donna and Shubik Bandopadhyay. Okay, you can start. You don't have a PowerPoint as far as I know, but please let us inform us about the current situation and what are you doing for arts and culture and civil society. You have
Fantastic. Thank you. It's really great to be here, and I think lots of what we want to share with you really picks up on that last presentation, because it's very much the issues we've been grappling with. So yeah, I hope this is a good segue. I will just make a few sort of general points about us and about the UK context, and then I'll hand over to Shobik, who will talk in more detail about the Arts Fund and how that context really keys into this bigger discussion. Just for those of you who don't know us, we're a relatively large funder in the UK context. So we give away about £40 million a year, and usually no more than £10 million a year to arts and arts education work, which makes us one of the larger private funders of the arts in the UK. But it's not a huge amount, and in some ways I think it shows that in the UK the funding landscape is a bit different to in Europe. Our mission is very much about social justice, so thinking about how we create a world where everyone can thrive, can be themselves, and particularly for young people. And we see our role as really tackling those kind of deep-seated underlying structural reasons for prejudice and harm, and thinking about what we can do in that context to kind of push back. We are always thinking about how we act in a way that is anti-racist, and how that framing is really crucial to tackling other forms of othering as well, and all of our kind of work and our strategy. So lots of that is really relevant to our discussion, which is why I sort of bring it in at the start. And alongside the arts, we also fund a lot in the youth space and in the migration space. So again, in those kind of arenas, we're kind of at the at the sharp end of some of these difficult conversations. Just to kind of zoom out a little bit for the UK context. So the generally in the UK, the government spend on culture is low compared to Europe on a kind of head per capita basis. And over the last period, particularly local funding has gone down hugely. So we think from 2010, funding from local authorities to culture has gone down by about 50%, 50%. So that's huge. And there have been substantial cuts to government funding, Arts Council funding as well, and far greater than philanthropy on its own could ever replace, even if that were desirable. But I guess potentially more positively, and in the context of this discussion around polarisation, we do now have a new socialist government, a Labour Party that was elected in July. And they've been very clear that they view the arts as really essential to a thriving and healthy society and a healthy democracy. And they're not going to be sort of picking fights with the arts sector. Now, that doesn't mean that there's necessarily more money on the table. And, we've got a lot of work to do to kind of ameliorate the damage. Prior to this current government, we had obviously a Conservative government for about 14 years. And I would say that the government and the right-wing media really led a number of campaigns that were specifically about kind of demeaning and undermining work that cultural organisations were doing, that was about trying to engage with contested histories or questions of identity and equity. So we've been sort of managing this context that we would call the culture wars for quite a long time, and government got quite heavily involved in that at various moments. I think if you're interested in that, I'm very happy to take questions, but the National Trust has kind of done an incredible kind of fight back into that context. And we've also published some work on how do you as cultural organizations kind of work in that really difficult communications environment. So I can put a link into that if people are interested. All is not rosy, however, even with the previous government having moved on. We had awful racially motivated riots in the UK over the summer, and this sense of the rising polarisation is a huge and very present concern. I think we're lucky in some ways that we have a very strong arm's length principle between our main arts funding and the government. But I think the situation in the US will impact us, and things can change very quickly. So I'll hand over to Shobik in just a second, but we really see our role as protecting that kind of independence and integrity of the art space, and also thinking about what does it mean to have a thriving, inclusive, locally rooted arts scene that is a human right and a human necessity. And what if we have that, that will contribute to a much healthier kind of space for everyone. We're also increasingly supporting narrative change, which is looking at the role of popular culture, and what does that mean in terms of kind of winning public hearts and minds. And I can very happy to answer questions on that too. But I guess just to finish by saying, you know, this is has to be quite sort of deep long-term work. And we have to be doing that alongside that kind of much more defensive, immediate work. And I think that is really hard, but spaces like this where we can learn from each other and connect are really useful. I'll pass over to Shobik.
Thanks, Holly. Hi, everyone. Yeah, really nice to be here with you all. Yeah, so I was just going to talk a bit about our arts fund, which is our main open arts funding program. So one that organizations can apply to without being invited or anything like that. And yeah, we did a big kind of refresh of the program when I joined the foundation just about 2 years ago, and we've been through one round of funding so far. So we distribute around £6.5 million a year. So we've just kind of been through one round of that. Although obviously those grants have just started, so there's a lot more learning to come on that. And yeah, everything that Elena just shared around hyper-instrumentalisation and also some of the questions that came back to her about kind of how we respond to that as funders and how we move away from some of those approaches and what we do in place of that. And that is very, very firmly like the subtext, the context of the fund that we developed the fund in. I won't dwell on any of that stuff now, just because I guess we could lose all our time thinking about those things, and they are interesting, but maybe for another time. So yeah, the fund, I mean, the foundation has always been, as Holly said, it's never been an arts funder which has funded, you know, just things that the trustees like just because they like them. It's always had a belief in the kind of importance of democracy and culture, but obviously the way that looks has changed a lot over time. I'll just say a few things about the way the fund shapes up now. It isn't, you know, the kind of fund which is explicitly about any one single issue like climate change or housing or mental health or anything like that. It looks at the emerging artistic practice across all those fields, and it's looking to support practice which often illuminates the connections and the common root causes of many of those different issues. So polarization, as you can imagine, shows up a lot in the fund, but it's not, I would say it's more of a kind of symptom of the things that we're looking at rather than a cause. So, you know, an inability to kind of reach consensus or find ways forward around some of those other issues that we were talking about. I think for us, we see polarization as a product of unequal access to information, a lack of shared civic spaces, as I think was mentioned earlier. You know, just that sense that things aren't moving forward and are incapable of moving forward within our current systems. And I guess, you know, we're interested in whose voices are heard on the issues that matter. And often, you know, when we hear more voices, more different voices, we find quite surprising points of alignment, and perhaps also points of disagreement, which might be more useful or a bit more generative than our kind of traditional, or what seems to be the kind of orthodox oppositional discourse that we have in public at the moment. And I think it's important that we recognize actually that cultural policy, and you know, even the foundation itself, but more, I guess, government cultural policy, has really kind of contributed to that polarization in some ways, because you know, we've historically focused our investment in urban centers. We've kind of taken some quite top-down approaches to things like diversity and inclusion, obviously with good intentions, but often with a focus on data collection, compliance, rather than kind of the more nuanced challenges of creating spaces for dialogue and for belonging. And I think that's really reflected in the practice that we've supported over you know, looking back in time. So you know, lots of arts organizations seeking to kind of do social engagement, but through quite traditional art forms and arts practice. And our feeling is that that work has kind of run its course now. You know, by and large, I'm sure there are exceptions. And a couple of things, I guess, that really, when we were working on the fund, we felt we wanted to try and find ways to overcome were the kind of tendency to oversimplify issues, whatever they are, you know, making art about social justice issues rather than kind of thinking about how artists and art really get into the texture of those issues and kind of help us reach a more nuanced understanding of what's really going on. And very much related to that, I think also, you know, just that risk of kind of fetishizing issues by detaching them from real life and, you know, making a spectacle of them. It's something that we know is a risk with socially engaged art. It can happen. It happens a lot. Never with those intentions, but that's you know, something we wanted to hold ourselves accountable to try and find ways to kind of get beyond that. So that's the kind of the central concerns of the fund, I guess, in its new iteration. We're supporting artistic practice, which I guess explores and critiques those issues of social justice from new perspectives, and also then thinks about how those perspectives can be communicated through art forms and cultural practices which are more embedded in daily life. They don't need to be new. They often are new, or they feel new, at least to us. And you know, they often build community around shared identities, around shared practice and interests as well in the longer term. All the grants we make are 3 years at the moment, up to £300,000, £100,000 a year. I guess something we've learned from this so far is that the work is often happening on the margins, you know, and those margins could be geographic margins, economic margins, social margins, cultural margins, any combination of these factors. And that usually means that the people doing the work are affected by multiple systems of oppression, and their practice is often very unsupported and precarious in what is already a relatively unsupported and precarious sector. So our approach has really had to change in order to do this work. We've had to, you know, as we're a team of 5, we just received nearly 500 applications for our last round, and we only make about 30 grants. So, you know, this means obviously reading a lot of applications, but it also, more than that, means kind of very in-depth discussions amongst the team to really kind of build and challenge ourselves, build our knowledge and challenge ourselves. And a lot of travel, which is something we didn't do much of before, but we're really finding ourselves going to parts of the country that we didn't go to much at all before, because we're increasingly prioritizing work which is offering those different perspectives. It really helps us get beyond the written word, I think, which is really important for this kind of work, and understand people's perspectives from the place that they actually do the work. I'm just going to talk about one example of an organization. I saw there was someone on here from Repeat. They might know about this organization because they're based in the Flowland, or right next to the Flowland in the north of Scotland. They're called Timespan, and they're a composite of a visual arts gallery, a local history archive, a library, and a community centre. And the village they're based in, called Helmsdale, has very historic ties to both North Sea fishing and North Sea oil industries, both of which are, you know, not what they were once, and now they are facing challenges of rural urban migration, young people not wanting to stay in the village, and also kind of compounding issues of the climate crisis as well.
Thank you, Shobik. Can I just interrupt for a second? There is
Sure.
a raised hand, but also I would like to suggest that we kind of wrap up this presentation and give the floor also to Geert, so that we can have all the questions together at the end, because we are running out of time.
Oh, sure.
How about that?
Yes. You want me to stop now? I can stop now, or I can
Yeah,
finish now.
if it's okay, of course, if you have nothing else to add, but that was good that you gave the example. So,
Sure, yeah, I can send it around as well. Yeah.
so
no problem.
my suggestion would be that we move to the next speaker and get all the questions at the end, if that's okay.
No
Yes.
problem.
Yeah, because there is a presentation also by Geert, and he's waiting. So thank you very much. I think for the sake of time, we have to move to the next speaker. And please put your questions in the chat, immediate questions in the chat. We'll pick them up later. And I would like now to give the floor to Geert Oskam from the Cultuurfonds in the Netherlands.
Thank you, Seta.
And yes, so you just introduce yourself really briefly and start and share the
I
presentation.
will.
Thank you.
And I'm saying good morning to you because I'm in the Dutch Caribbean. Someone has to do it. And we have a board meeting here as we're also active in the Dutch Caribbean. So it's quite early in the morning here. And Ilaria, I believe you were trying to share my slides, right?
Maybe Letizia. I mean, I'm ready to do so, but I think my colleague is.
Yeah, I'm
Oh,
gonna
great.
put up just a
Okay.
second. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I'll just start talking. So good morning here from the Dutch Caribbean. My name is Geert Oskam. I'm the head of the philanthropic programs and lead in impact evaluation at Cultuurfonds. And thank you for having me. And as the other speakers also, I was asked to speak a bit on how our foundation is tackling the influence of the political polarization for art and how arts funding is reacting to this. I hope to give you a short overview on what we are doing as an organization, without it becoming a sort of a beauty contest, but I hope to give you some inspiration at least. So for the second slide, let me start with a short introduction. Cultuurfonds has been active since 1945 and is one of the largest independent cultural foundations in the Netherlands for arts and culture. So we started 85 years ago, right after the Second World War, and our main aim since then, from the beginning on, has been to create a well-connected and a resilient society through arts and culture, which is, of course, still very relevant today and even more relevant, you might add. So we have an annual budget also of around 40 million to be distributed in the Netherlands, the Dutch Caribbean, and Suriname. And we are a hybrid foundation, meaning we have an endowment, but also we are specialized specifically in dedicated funds, often coming out of legacy gifts. So we have over 500 of them under the umbrella of the Cultuurfonds, and annually we give around 5,000 grants in the Netherlands and Dutch Caribbean, Suriname. And for the last few years, as you can see, perhaps in the visualization, it's been also a time of transition for us as an organization, not just internally, but also in response to a broader societal and sort of political shifts that we've been seeing. So het Cultuurfonds, as we are named now, formerly known as the Prins Bernhard Cultuurfonds, has evolved also with this new name and visual identity, aiming at making our work as a foundation more accessible to a diverse and inclusive audience, lowering the threshold for grantees and appealing also to this broader audience. And the idea behind is that we as an organization saw that it was also time for us as funders to come out of the shadows as a sort of silent funder and become a more stronger voice in the arts and culture, and a champion for culture, so to say, putting the needs of our grantees, I think, with this action also more on top of our organization's priority, and not just in financial support, but also speaking out for arts and culture. Now, coincidentally, we find ourselves navigating a changing political and funding environment. And while we as a foundation work towards making cultural funding more inclusive and resilient, we also do this in, of course, in a time where the government's approach to arts and culture is uncertain. And I'd like to talk a bit about what the current government's, on the second slide, current government's stance is on arts and culture. I think a striking example is that the word culture is not mentioned once in our government's coalition agreement, a clear indication that arts and culture are not seen as a national priority in these times, or at least viewed with ambiguity. And in addition, I can say that the government has attempted to raise taxes on arts and culture, and this was successfully, for now at least, opposed through advocacy efforts by a broad coalition of organizations, where we as the Cultuurfonds also took sort of main stage as a spokesperson against these tax raises. The government has also surprisingly raised the ceiling for tax-free giving. So, and at the same time, they're talking quite negative, or there's a negative perspective, at least, on philanthropy. So often framed now as a tax avoidance, or it's something being untransparent. So there's a sort of duality in this. In one hand, raising the ceiling for tax-free giving, but also a sort of negative perspective on philanthropy. Another idea is that there's this vague notion of cultural funding should shift to more local and rural initiatives, rather than focusing on sort of on established institutions in urban areas. But there's no real clear framework on how this should be implemented, for example. And lastly, and I think this is currently something that I think as funders all should be really aware of. Most recently, our government, for example, has cut overseas development aids, overseas development aid budgets. I think signaling a shift in global priorities, and this means that philanthropic individuals and foundations will also be more called upon to fill these gaps in overseas development aids, pulling away funds, I think, from arts and culture. So we're facing not only a government with possible budget cuts to arts and culture, but also more budget cuts on other fields which draw away support for arts and culture. And I think this is something we all should be really aware of. All in all, I think this kind of political ambiguity creates uncertainty for cultural institutions, for artists, for funders, forcing them to become more adaptable. Well, I can tell you a bit about how the Cultuurfonds at least is trying to respond to this. In the next slide, I show you some of those examples. I think, importantly, we should not only see it as a challenge, but also as an opportunity to innovate for us as foundations, to ensure that cultural funding remains strong and diverse and future-proof. We'd like to say internally, never waste a good crisis, which often also means that it's a way sort of to look at your own organization again, what you're doing. So the 4 key ways that we're trying to respond is, at least, first, diversifying grant making opportunities. For decades, we as a cultural foundation have been known for short-term, low-risk project grants. And while these still remain important, of course, we're also broadening our funding models. So to offer trust-based grants, specifically for individual artists who want to develop themselves. I think real innovation and real opposition comes often from individual artists. So we're opening up our funding possibilities much more for these artists, allowing more autonomy and also creative freedom for artists. We are diversifying our grant making opportunities by offering more multiple year grants, organizational development grants, and we're looking more into participatory grant making, of course, also experimenting this way with more community-led decision-making models as a way to make it more democratic in these times. So secondly, we're improving our accessibility. Funding is most useful, of course, if it reaches the people who needs it the most. So that's why we're also actively working towards creating new, clearer funding routes on our website to improve accessibility, engaging with underrepresented communities within the Netherlands as well, talk with people who actually need the money, so that we can also open up our foundation and our ways and our routes much more to these people. And also we see now that our funding criteria should be regularly updated. It's something I think should be every year on the table, and how our grants reflect the changing needs within the sector. Thirdly, I think strengthening collaborations and advocacy, I think, is very important in these times as well. So we recognize that no single funder can address these challenges alone. So we need to build coalitions and stronger partnerships also with other foundations. So we join forces in advocacy, what I mentioned in terms of this tax increases. But also we want to collaborate much more in joint funding initiatives pooling resources to provide larger, more sustainable support also for organizations. And lastly, prioritizing diversity and inclusion and critical voices, which I think is super important right now, specifically also in the Netherlands. We need to protect artist freedom and support diverse perspectives in the arts. So we prioritize arts organizations that amplify underrepresented voices. We really prioritize that in the grants that we give, but also as a hybrid foundation, we're also doing our fundraising specifically on critical causes that the government is sort of stepping down on. In this way, we can also step up where the government falls short. And one of the concrete actions there is that we have a thematic program within the foundation. It's called Fonds ZOZ, a fund specifically aimed at young artists making work fighting polarization and discrimination. Very important. On the last slide, coming to a conclusion for us, while political uncertainty poses a challenge for arts and fundings, I think it also is an opportunity, what I mentioned before, for us as a philanthropic organization and for us as a philanthropic field, in the way that we are trying to take a leading role is so in shaping the future of cultural support. And I think we at the Cultuurfonds, we think that a thriving cultural sector is not just a luxury, it's essential to a strong and democratic society. And here I show you some of the posters or design, the campaign that we launched right after the government came into office last year, urging people to visit culture, to give to culture, and also for cultural organizations to apply for grants to the Cultuurfonds, something we didn't do in the last 85 years, but we're really trying to step out as well, telling people that the world is better with culture, taking a stance there as well. And a final thought, as I said, never waste a good crisis. I think foundations often have an internal culture that doesn't really foster change. We often see that people working in foundations are very sensitive to social changes, but we find it difficult to put it into action. And I think now really is the time to make a change, also internally in foundation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geer. That was super insightful and very useful, I think, to nurture a discussion after that. So I would invite everyone who has questions for both organizations, the three speakers, of course, from Paul Hamlin Foundation and from the Het Cultuurfonds, to raise your hands. There is one question in the chat, but I would like to take one from the floor. Chris Storch, hello.
Hello, thank you very, very much. This has been, it just awakens many questions. But one thing that I really want to underline, and especially considering what Holly was saying from Paul Hamlin about the conservative political tendency to ignore culture and to marginalize it and to defund it, quite simply. Let us remember that the extreme right is completely aware of the importance of culture. In fact, they have made it a priority in many, many places where the extreme right is rising. It's just a question of what is culture, what kind of culture. So this ambiguity is growing, not because it's against culture, but for what kind of culture, for a nationalist agenda and with a political and populist embracing of the entertainment industry. Which is, of course, not the same thing as the culture I think that most of us are talking about. I think that the essential question of advocacy is that we need to underline that culture is about developing critical thinking in a society where we are overwhelmed with information and it's difficult to get critical. So what my question is here is about where the funding should go. You mentioned, Geer, about investing in the individual development of emerging artists. And this is, of course, very important. We need to have places, incubators, places where artists are given empowered and given skills and have the capacity to reach out to new audience groups. But at the same time, if we're also then developing emerging artists, but the defunding and the weakening of institutional platforms that present these artists, then in fact what we're creating is a kind of marginalized cult of artists where people are developing individually, but where there's no common place for people to gather. So I think the creation of space locally and regionally is really one of the most significant and important investments that you could be making. Do you see problems with this that you are developing? That I see a number of programs, Culture Moves Europe, Perform Europe, other things being done from the European side, from the EU side, which are developing artists, but then the artists have nowhere to go when they're ready. When they have something to say, it's very, very difficult for them to present their work. How can we manage this this dichotomy between individual development and collective space? Thank you.
Who would like to answer that first? Paul Hamlin, maybe. To whatever you.
Yeah,
prefer.
I can offer my thoughts on that. It's something we talk about a lot. Partly because I guess we've historically had relationships with a lot of those institutions, and now we are overtly kind of like not funding them as much as we were before. I think that at the moment it feels particularly difficult because at least in the UK, like the cost of living has made running venues particularly like even more kind of challenging than it has been. I think the combination of energy prices, etc., but also kind of post-COVID audience behavior making things more difficult in terms of business models. But I think that I guess a counter to or just a different perspective on what you were suggesting, Chris, is that a lot of those organizations as well have been talking about diversifying their program and supporting marginalized artists for a long time and not doing it, or at least doing a pretty bad job of it. So, you know, faced with a choice, I feel comfortable that, you know, they have the means to platform artists if they want to. They might have to do less of some other things, but those are choices that they might have to make for right now. Hopefully, in the longer term, it doesn't become a zero-sum game like it feels like it is now, where we have to take from one to give to another. But at the moment, that is, I think, a conscious choice, and it's a rebalancing of maybe some historic underinvestment in artists still working on the margins more.
Thank you. Here, you want to answer this one, or we can check for other questions?
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
just go ahead.
I understand what you're saying, Chris, indeed, in terms of what if you have all these developed artists with no place to show their art. Indeed, we try to look at it always as a sort of, in Dutch we'd say keten, but it's a chain, right? So every part of the chain is important for artists or art or the idea of culture to come sort of to fruition. And we try either to do it within the Cultuurfonds with the budget that we have. Obviously, 40 million is a lot of money, but can't support a complete chain. But we always try to see who are the key indicators within a region, for example, who gives space to an artist, or who then afterwards can develop a specific talent into a next level. And that's also what I mentioned. We try to work together as closely as we can with other funders within the cultural field, who picks up what bill. So we try to build this change in supporting art throughout different disciplines.
Thanks. There is one more question from the chat, which is actually touching upon that philanthropy and funding organizations that support civil society and freedom of expression and also various causes are also under scrutiny in many countries. And they are under scrutiny politically, but also by the civil society itself. And how can we address that, especially when it is, some foreign funders in certain countries are also not seen very positively by governments lately, or by local players of different sorts. And this is spreading across Europe too. So we are also not safe. How can we actually act in such a situation?
I mean, I would just offer something. I think it's a good question. I think there isn't an easy answer. I think for us, we have to be transparent, because I think the minute we are not transparent, we become shady money, and we become those elite forces behind the scenes. Kind of nobody knows who they are, where's their legitimacy, why are they supporting this thing? So I think transparency remains important. That doesn't necessarily mean high level visibility. And I think perhaps we have to operate in a slightly more nuanced way now, because the threats are different, and we are not the people who will ultimately be, you know, harmed. Probably, like, we're not putting our lives on the line, but in some cases that is what we're talking about, as we know. Particularly our colleagues in Eastern Europe will tell us that. So that is a different calculus. We've got a small fund in India, and they've been obviously managing this challenge for a long time, and we know that donors are not welcome in many ways in India now. But yes, I don't think there's an easy answer.
Are there any other questions that you want to raise from the floor? We are 2 minutes over time, but maybe one more question would be possible, and then we wrap up very briefly. I don't see any hands at the moment. I think there is a lot of reflection after these presentations and the topics we have discussed. Maybe I just wrap up quickly and say that this is certainly not the last conversation on the topic. Well, we have mentioned already that at Philea Forum, we're going to address at least in the freedom of expression and the arts autonomy of arts, but this is not all. There are a lot more issues that have come up in the turbulent times we are living in, and they are not getting any less turbulent, as we have seen what is going on in the past few days, literally, and how this would affect the entire Europe and the world, we don't know yet. So there will be a lot of work for us foundations in arts and culture, and also broadly defined ones to do in the coming months and years. What my personal takeaways from this conversation is basically philanthropy can do work. We can do a lot of work, but I think it's only, at least my personal impression, there is no way to solve the issues only with grants alone. What Geert mentioned, I think it's super important. We all have to transform our way of working and adapt to the challenges and the urgencies that appear. So on the one hand, we have to address urgencies, tackle them immediately as soon as possible. So act quickly, transform our work quickly, and move on to address the most important challenges of the day. But on the other hand, we cannot lose the longer term perspective and the impact. No, I'm not talking like the measurable whatever impact. I'm talking about what is going to happen next, to try to anticipate the work that we do and the work that others do with our support few steps ahead, and build up more sustainable structures, more sustainable and meaningful ways to intervene. And this is not only by grants. Of course, grants are super important for everyone, but we also need to provide other tools. And that came also through our studies, our surveys that we have shared. Also, the how philanthropy works in arts and culture in Europe. There is advocacy more and more needed. That's what I do for the past, I don't know how many years, in culture policy and in the area of arts and culture. We need to help also our beneficiaries, but also our partners, to build up stronger arguments for arts and culture in the changing world. And we saw from Elena's presentation, culture and arts is still a bubble, and we need to have a bit more broader view on the role arts and culture play in the societies and how we as foundations can amplify it. But we have to change our arguments, apparently. We have to build stronger arguments and stronger voices. So media was mentioned also. I think it's very important how we also communicate about the work that is being done through our support, and to also create more spaces, like safe spaces and spaces for collaboration, civic spaces, because where they are really lacking. And that was also tackled by Paul Hamlin colleagues. Last but not least, switch or try to readapt from lower risk investment or lower risk support, which is often used for the longer term perspective, to a higher risk, but let's say emergency support, which can be very, very useful nowadays. And we cannot act alone. I think that's also what our director, Andre Wilkens, would have loved to say at this moment, if he were here. We need to pool resources together and join forces together. That's why this Arts and Culture Funders Forum is a very good platform, where we could take initiative and pooling resources together to make our impacts stronger and address those issues better. So I think that's what I'm going to say for the time being, besides inviting you to join the upcoming webinars that we are organizing in April and May. Ilaria has shared in the chat the link for the registration. The next webinar is on 15th of April. So you are most welcome to register and take part. There will be different topic, but I am sure that there is a lot that also you could contribute with your experiences. Sorry for the short, for the 7 minutes over time, but I hope this was useful and we will stay in touch for the future. Ilaria, would you like to say a few words at the end?
No, you said it all, but really looking forward to seeing you again on World Arts Day on the 15th of April.
Thank you very much once
Bye.
again. Bye-bye.